Oh, for a lot of my allotment ideas, I use these 25-litre jerry cans. I use reclaimed ones or repurposed ones. They're from a car wash, a hand car wash that's local to me, and they keep all their detergent or comes in these containers. So they use a few of those every week. So there's loads of these to pick up for free. They're made out of high density polyethylene, so they're very sturdy. You need to protect them from ultraviolet because the white ones, the natural ones, will deteriorate over time. The the black coloured containers seem to contain carbon black, which makes them UV stabilised, so they'll last a lot longer. So you can keep those outdoors. But most of these will be in a polytunnel as well, so there's a little bit of protection from ultraviolet. But a lot of the containers are cut in half, so I've put a little dashed line to sort of show where I cut. And in the comments or in the description on here, I'll show where the cut line is. This is 205 above the base of the bin, but for the various projects, they kind of vary a little bit. So what I'm doing here, the lower half I can kind of use as a grow bucket or a reservoir, and it's got a 25mm hole in there for an electrical grommet, and then a solvent well PVC overflow pipe is 21.5mm outside diameter, so that fits in nicely into the rubber grommet. The top half I'll show some other sketches where a bit more detail, but I drill holes into the sides, and the top half of the bucket is inverted, and then that's buried, so the cut line there is level with the surface of the soil. And then what happens, you put part composted material into that container, and then the worms from the native worms from the surrounding soil will move in, and they'll consume all that organic matter, and you'll end up with worm casts or a vermicompost. Alternatively, different wormeries and things, I use this actual threaded part of the container. I'll cut that off using a hole saw, and then this part here I'll drill out and then use that as an aeration fitting. So I use every part of the container. But a little bit further on in here, this is just a little drawing to show quite a crudely made fixture I use alongside with a multi-cutter or fine multi-master, which is a brand name, and that's a little oscillating saw. It has quite a thin blade with quite small fine teeth, so it's quite good for cutting through the HDPE plastic. And because this is flush cutting, the base of that blade, I made this fixture, and you can just run the base of the blade along there, and then that stabilizes it, so you get a nice sort of clean cut-off line. And the high density polyethylene actually planes quite well, so if you get any rough edges, I just run a plane around that, and it smooths it quite well. And with this, I made a gauge block that fits under here, and I've got holes on each of the four sides, and then I just put a small self-tapping screw in there. When its container's full, I hold the block against the side, slide this fixture down so that bottom surface of the fixture is on level on that guide bush, and then I've used a cordless drill just to put the screws in, and then I use the multi-master just to kind of run around and cut that off at the right height. Obviously different size gauge blocks will give you a different height overall. When I use these as wormeries or fermenting bins, I actually use that little pilot hole in there to enlarge it to around about 27mm, and I put an aeration fitting on each four sides as well. But for my reservoirs, it's just left with a small hole, which isn't a problem. So that's the little jigs I used to cut them out, and that just shows the top half of the container, which is used as an in-ground worm bed. What I've shown on here, it looks a bit like a kind of Swiss cheese, but there's these 5 holes, like a kind of number 5 on a dice just drilled there, and the one above is actually larger, so these are around about 22mm, and this one's maybe about 27mm, like that. And what it does, it enables you to get a finger or a thumb or even a sort of dibber or something like that through that hole, and it makes it much easier to pull these up from the ground when you come to harvest the finished castings. because you've got to bear in mind there's lots of worm activity around these, and so the surrounding soil and the worm casts are going to kind of combine into one a little bit as well. So it means this thing is really well fixed into the ground. It's almost hydraulic when you try and pull this thing out. So you need a little bit of purchase, and I'd suggest yeah, something like a wooden dibber is good, because you can push that through the hole, and it just gives you a bit more purchase, like a handle, and you can just pull the thing out. Once it's angled, it comes out the ground fairly simply. So I'll just go through. Here's my Vitruvian worm. So this image here, let's get a bit more distance on this, quite large. This is an old A4 paper tray from the school where I work. All the teaching equipment is normally stored in these, can't think of the brand name now, but they're these sort of basically for A4 paper or booklets or stationery and things. They're in these plastic trays. The science department was recently revamped, so they chucked all the old beige ones and replaced them with blue ones. So there's maybe about 30 of these containers. So I thought they were quite good to make into capillary trays. On here I'm showing an automatic PVC overflow pipe which goes around to feed these trays. But alternatively, you can just fill them up manually by a watering can. What I've done is used a piece of reclaimed 6mm or 5mm acrylic. I've drilled a couple of 40mm holes in each end, and then I sit this on wooden blocks, so this plastic is slightly higher than the rim on that tray. And then around this I wrap capillary matting or sort of wool shoddy or even cotton t-shirts and things like that. And there's a perforated polythene covering that just stops excess evaporation through the capillary matting, so it means the water in the reservoir lasts a little bit longer. But what I'm showing you on here is I'm using biochar, which is basically charcoal. So when the plants are on here, the pots will stand on top of that capillary matting, and this is sort of wrapped around that plastic. Excess sort of nitrates and things will tend to wash out from the pots. You might want once in a while just water the plant pots from the top of the surface of the soil as well. Soil will get washed through here. This is not shown on here, but there's holes in here, so it's permeable, and then those nitrates will end up into the water in the reservoir. So what happens is the biochar is negatively charged, so the nitrates are kind of latch onto the charcoal, and that will help to activate the charcoal, and then you can use that as a soil additive. But the other thing I've shown here is just a piece of 40mm overflow pipe. So I drill 48mm holes through the plastic, and then this is slightly out. This really should be shown above. So when this is all sandwiched together, I push that pipe through. I cut little tabs through the opening here, and then that makes a little fill valve or a little filler nozzle. And I'll do one here and one here as well, because then when you're filling, you can kind of see what the level is in that reservoir. But moving on from this, I decided this was very effective, and seedlings that I had germinating in seed trays on the plant, in plant pots and in small seed trays on top of these capillary mats, they basically survived 6 months, or even seeds which were slow to germinate. After a number of months, they were germinating, and then I was just potting on the plants from these. So it just goes to show that there is a lot of nitrate in that water. So it makes sense to use the biochar to activate that. But moving on from this, obviously there's only so much space you can use on top of these trays. So I was thinking about extending this and then making it into an actual grow bucket itself using the 25-litre containers. So on here, it's not the best drawing, but that just shows the two-part container. So this is a cut down 25-litre container. I've got a kind of worms tower or soil feeding station in here, and then so this is the sort of self-contained top part, which has got holes in the bottom, and this is the lower container. So it's the what I call the 2-container 25-litre grow bucket. So it's made out of 2 separate containers. So this one isn't inverted. This is the base of one bucket, and this is the base of another kind of bucket. In here, though, it's quite hard to see. There's quite a lot going on. Once again, the same as this one, I've got the 25mm hole and the electrical grommet in here, and then this is a 21mm overflow pipe. So I've got that as a filler. So you water from one central tank, and that can be automated with float valves and water butts and things like that. But I've got a little elbow that turns up here, and so this is a 330mm drinks can that I've just punched a hole into the side, and then you kind of slot that over to the elbow, and I've punched some holes in there so it allows any trapped air to exit, so you can fill up from that one place, and then the water will fill up to the top of that elbow. And then what else is going on here is these wooden blocks, and the wooden blocks support this plastic subfloor, which again is made from recycled or reclaimed acrylic from a laser cutter's sort of scrap bin. And there's a central hole in here, and then shown here is this little piece here. This is actually a cut down PET 500mm water bottle, and then I've wrapped around cotton towels and cardboard to make a kind of sort of like a spiral wrapped round together, and then that's pushed into that PET bottle. So these little pieces of cotton that fan out are actually fed through that hole. So if you imagine this is like a kind of flat surface that's supported on those wooden blocks, and then you've got that capillary tap, what I call it on here, it's a sort of capillary tube, and then that bears onto the bottom of that worm tower as well. So there's lots of moisture from the worm food and bedding, and so that's actually wicking moisture up from the bed, and then the excess moisture is basically draining back down into that reservoir. Because there's a number of these wooden blocks, there's so much of the volume is actually filled up by the wood, and then the gaps between the wood, I've got rolls of corrugated cardboard, and also, as with this one, I've got the biochar filling in there as well. So that's the basis of the basic 25-litre grow bucket. So moving on to the next page, this is just a little bit more detailed view, just what's going on in the previous grow bucket. And once again, I've got the worm tower here, and this was actually a poster tube, which was quite large diameter, so it fitted perfectly around this 10mm weld wire mesh, and I just rolled that round, and I used a piece of 68mm down pipe just to sort of roll it round to form it to the right size. And then on here, I just the ends of these, I just twisted them round so that you didn't have any sharp sort of barbs coming out from that wire. And I've cut that away there, but obviously the cardboard goes right up to the surface of the sort of substrate, the compost that's in the container. And I'm using a terracotta plant pot, which has got a little bit of weight, and that sits over the top of the mesh. So if you've got any food in here, and if the rodents are a problem, they're not just going to be able to climb straight down there and then just eat all that food and then just leave. They might be, initially, they might be interested, and they might try and dig around, but then they'll notice that the mesh is in the way there. And after a while, they probably won't. They'll go somewhere else where it's easier to feed. So there's a weld wire mesh, and it's about a millimetre gauge. I'm not sure what the wire gauge is. It's galvanised, and the hole size is about 10mm, so that's a nice size for all the worms can move around, and they'll eat the cardboard itself. And this is just showing the base of the bucket's got 25mm holes. You can't see it there, but there's actually a 50mm hole drilled here with a hole saw. And then when the upper container nestles down into the lower container, it's supported by the plastic subfloor here. But then that capillary tube is actually pushing up inside of this container, so there's a bit more sort of contact for wicking the capillary action, or getting the capillary action to start. With these containers, though, it's funny, capillary action needs that contact. So what I'll do is I'll get this soil saturated, and then put on the drain pipe here, I'll put a container up here, and I'll cycle the water through it. So you'll get a little bit of runoff through those holes, and then that will sort of sit on that capillary matting on here, so it tend to wick back through. If this is really dry, you might find the soil is just sort of bridging across there, and it's not actually making contact. So you'll need to spend after a couple of days, and obviously once the worms are moving around, they'll burrow through here. This is capillary matting. I use little pieces of capillary matting, and also just cotton fabric. So the cotton fabric will be eaten by the worms anyway. So there'll be movement through these holes. So once this is established, there'll be a really good cycle of aeration and movement, and worms consuming the organic matter, and then inoculating the biochar with castings and nitrate from that container. And obviously, with this being a wicking tray, I'll fill it up from a central point, and then I'll possibly give it a month, let that water run through, and then refill that with fresh rainwater as well. So the water will be cycled as well, so it won't be sitting in sort of stagnant water. And what is interesting as well, when you've got these wooden blocks here, and that water level is moving up and down, the biochar itself is actually floating. So the larger pieces will be exposed to air. So they're not just going to be completely saturated. There'll be a certain amount of air and moisture, and then transfer of moisture through into the sort of drier parts of the material, and they'll be moved about by that ebb and flow of water as well. So this isn't static, which is quite good, and I think it's quite nice to have that aeration and movement in these containers. Alternatively, if you fill this up from a central point, you can actually close off that valve, or close a valve to close off the filler, and then you can drain the system. But what I'm hopefully trying to do is, once plants are actually growing in these grow buckets, they will use that moisture up, and after a number of months, their roots will be working down into that material as well. So that will be an extension of the plant sort of root system, that you've got all this biochar and additional organic matter as well that will directly benefit the nitrates and nutrients in there will be made available to the plants. So that's the grow bucket. And yeah, I think another thing on what I was thinking about here, the water level, when it's at the highest, the capillary action only works for about 300 millimeters. So if you make this container 350 millimeters tall, the top 50 millimeters wouldn't really be moist enough for plants to grow. It would kind of dry out and form a bit of a crust on there. So if you've got weed seeds blowing in, there's not enough moisture for those to germinate. But larger plants with established root systems will be reaching down for that irrigation. And with the plants as well, because this water is moving downwards and then up and then down again, as it's going down, the plants will be rooting through the dry material to get access to that moisture, so that it encourages deep root growth as well, as opposed to watering from the surface, where the plants are always just rooting in that dry layer. And then when you water, they'll take up a certain amount of moisture, but most of that water will just run through the particles in the soil, and washing out nitrates and nutrients on the way. So this is quite nice. You're getting really deep rooting plants, and there's going to be that relative moisture is going to be there. And if you're starting plants off in this system, and then starting them earlier in the year under cover, and then hardying them, acclimatizing them to growing outdoors, you can physically move the whole container, and then when they're ready to plant out, they're going to be really super established plants. And you can just take the whole plant out, tip the bucket out, to do what you like. So it gives you that flexibility. And what is nice about this system as well, the irrigation and the biochar and the wooden blocks and all the various capillary matting is all separate from the actual grow bucket. So the grow bucket you can tip out and put new fresh compost in there, and you're not disturbing any of that system and pipe work as well. So it gives you that extra sort of flexibility. But what I was showing on this one is combining different methods of gardening. So there's a sort of elements of lasagna gardening. So you've got the compost, and on a deeper container, I'd normally use fairly rough compost lower down, and then nearer the surface I'd use more of a sort of sifted finished compost. So the smaller plants have got a nice friable material to grow into and put their tiny roots out. But as the plants are more established, they can grow into the heavier material. And also on this one, I'm just thinking about using native clay mixed with wood chip and biochar, just to actually encourage the worms here to become exposed to the aggregates and nutrients and particulates that are in the clay itself, rather than just working around pure compost. So I think they'll be breaking that clay and building more of an established soil, or more of a complete soil, rather than just consuming organic material that's in the compost. Otherwise that compost will gradually settle down. So I'm just, it's really finding another way of improving soils, even in the containers. And I think on the deep ones there's enough scope and enough depth to be able to benefit from that. On the smaller ones, where I'm making them the overall height 300 millimeters for starting off smaller plants, I want the moisture to be in the top surface as well. I just filled this with rougher compost further down, and then more of a sort of potting mix further up, and the compost higher up will have maybe 10% worm castings and maybe 10% biochar, possibly some perlite and vermiculite as well, just to create slightly different conditions if I want more drainage, or if I want kind of a heavier soil for more sort of squashes and things like that. So that's the two-part grow bucket, but showing the worm tower and then the flower pot for rodent protection as well. I've shown the first few sketches. Oh, this is quite a nice idea. This is just the cloche clip that's made by two Wests and Elliot, but on their version there's just a hole drilled in this little piece that holds the end panels of the cloches on. But what I've shown here is just replacing the M6 screw with an M6 coach bolt. So the head of the bolt is held captive in a square hole. I'm showing it here, but I'll file one of those holes out so it's square, and then I'll machine a slot here. So if you just slacken off that wing nut, you can slide this piece out, and it just makes it easier to remove that side panel if you want a little bit more ventilation. Once the cloche is all in place and it's held in with that screw, if you are trying to undo that, the whole M6 screw will rotate. So I'm replacing that with a coach bolt there, and that just gives you an idea of how it works. You've got this where's the pencil gone? Yeah, this aluminium tube here. The screw goes through the centre, and there's a washer, and then the wing nut, and then that, as you tighten this thread, that pulls up, and then it holds the glazing. And in this case I'm using a 5 or 6 millimeter acrylic, but you could use glass or tempered glass. So there's quite a lot going on in here, and this is a compost bin. It was built using concrete blocks, and I'm showing it here, but the soil levels are here. So this is actually built into a bank. So this is all earth around here. Is earth basically on three sides, and it's actually sitting on soil as well, but that soil is quite heavy clay. So to allow a little bit of aeration drainage, I got a plastic Euro pallet, and then I dug this out, so I almost undermined the concrete here. I just sort of kind of, the plastic pallet was slightly smaller, so I kind of left a little bit of soil intact here. So there is a little bit of soil contact as well, which is quite nice. I think you'll get, I don't know if worms come up from here, or if they'll come from, I would have thought they'd come from the organic matter that's surrounding this, and then work their way in underneath the lid, which isn't particularly well fitting. But what I've shown here, this is Euro pallet, so I think they're 600 by, or 800 by 900 or something odd. But they're not as big as a conventional pallet, which is about 1000 by 1200. So this is an aluminium channel here, and then I've got boards here that sort of slats for the door. So this is a footway here with concrete and paving slabs on top. And then to empty the bin, you can just slide these slats out from the top. And then this is areas for sort of hot composting. So you'll aerate this with a tool, and then you can turn this with a fork. But back here in the bin, I've got maturing composts in these 25-litre soil feeding stations. So it's sort of containerized. So I think it's quite nice. So as this material breaks down, you're segregating the older material from the new material that you're adding, and it's not flow through, but it gives you a little bit of compost whilst you're actually building compost at the same time. And it also, as the level settles down, the idea was that you could use these containers as worm containers and things like that. And so in the winter, as the compost is maturing, you're sort of segregating the new material and the old material. So you're not ending up with mature compost with kind of uncomposted apple cores and banana peels and things like that. But this is from Screwfix. It's an air brick duct, and it's there's actually a join on that little bit there. And this concertina's out, so it's telescopic. So you can, if you've got a kind of hollow floor or sort of suspended floorboards and joists, and you want air to get in there, maybe you've had an extension or changed some levels or something, you can run this up here, and then, or if there's another floor up here which is a concrete floor and you want to get air to that, you can use one of these ducts. But on here I've just shown this is an air brick vent. It's a rodent vent. It's called mouse mesh, and stainless steel, and it's super heavy duty, so some rats aren't going to be able to burrow through a plastic air brick and then get access and then go through the holes in here and get into the compost material. I haven't shown it on here, but there is a galvanized world wire mesh on here, the same as I use for the worm towers in the 2-part buckets. And what that it basically is a filter. It stops the compost falling through the openings in the pallet, and it just maintains that airspace underneath. So here is just the construction of the bin. This is concrete blocks, so high density concrete. And then what I've shown here are these wooden sort of collars that I'm using to create different levels of planting and capillary trays, and increase the available height under these cloches for plants. So what I've shown here, it's the actual 2-part grow bucket. So this is the reservoir part, and then this is the actual substrate with the compost in it, and then this will be the filler. So what I'm going to do, there's a shed here, and I'm hoping to set up a water butt which will run via float tank, and then that will fill up all these reservoirs in the bin. So this is a side view. There's actually 3 of those containers, so they can be run from one single location. And what I'm thinking about, having the capillary trays underneath the seed trays and the plants here as well, so they could all be run off the same kind of feed of rainwater. So it just means on a very hot day there's loads and loads of moisture available, so plants are kind of the moisture exchange through the leaves is condensing against the plastic, and then that's running back down into the container, so that's keeping the compost moist. But then that tray is being topped up from rainwater as well. And what I might do is have that on a timer as well, so it's only once a week it fills up, and then it allows it to empty out again. But on the capillary tray here, I've just shown here, I've got this capillary matting extending out from this container. So they've made these two flaps or wings. So what you can do, if you just want to use this as the capillary tray for the bucket on top, you can flap those capillary ears inwards, and then that capillary matting will just feed the plant above. Or alternatively, if this was buried in the soil or compost, then the capillary action from these as well would wick moisture from that reservoir, and it will keep the surrounding compost at a nice level of moisture. So which what I'm thinking is once the moisture is there, is it would make it more favourable to worms as well. So they'll probably move from the surrounding compost or be attracted to those conditions and then move into this um, reservoir and then work their way up into the grow bucket itself. But obviously, if you sit this container straight on compost itself, as the compost settles down, this level would change. That would sink down into this, and then if you're filling this up with a overflow pipe, the pipes would all be running up and down, and you wouldn't have that level. So what I've shown here is just a bit of 20mm mild steel flat bar that's been bent round. So this reservoir just sits in there, nestles in there, and it just holds it at the right height. So you can kind of get a little bit more headroom for the plants as the plants get larger, and they can grow under this cloche. If that was sitting straight on top, obviously this whole piece here would be lifted up higher, and then you'd need additional collars around here just to give it that sort of height that it can grow in. What I've shown here as well, there's just some offcuts of pallet wood that I'm sitting on top of those containers, and then the idea is as the compost breaks down, this container isn't sinking down into that lower one, it's just maintaining an air gap there, so there's a little bit more aeration, and then obviously you've got the irrigation as well, so you've got air and moisture. And these are the two Wests cloche clips which I've shown previously. So that's the soil feeding station, which can just be buried in the ground. An alternative, you could use this capillary reservoir as a lid on that worm bin if it's set in the ground, and then you've also got additional growing space here and a little bit of sort of automated watering of the surrounding soil around about a foot all around that. And this is another kind of concept, a hot composting bin providing heat for a grow space by combining a lean-to sort of roof as a sort of cold frame, or sort of what would be in fact be a kind of compost heated grow space. I'm just showing this north facing, so then the sunlight is hitting this, and you can change the angle depending on what your sort of latitude is. And then the back part of this would be insulated, and it would be black as well, so that would be like a kind of a little bit more solar gain that way. And what I've shown here is this is using the warm side of the compost bin as well, once again painted black to radiate out lots of heat. So this is a real sun trap, plus you're actually getting the benefit of any heat from the compost bin. The compost is going to be above ambient temperature most of the time anyway, so even if that's just maturing compost, it's kind of a big kind of heat sink, and so that will provide a certain amount of frost resistance overnight as well, for frost protection. And if you're actually actively managing this compost bin, then there's going to be lots of heat there, and then that could be 60-70 degrees, so that's really going to put loads of heat in here. And then it's also going to, having the cold frame lean to against the compost bin, you're preventing heat loss from the uninsulated sides, but then you're also providing a sort of solar gain, which is helping the microorganisms and the microbes in there to kind of get up to speed. But what I've shown on here is on the north face of this would be kind of slats, and you can remove those slats. But what I was thinking, there'll be some boards on top, but in terms of harvesting the compost, you probably only need to remove 2/3 of these boards, and that part here could sort of stay in situ, and obviously the sides and everything. So you can pretty much gain access to this whilst having that as a roof, and wouldn't have to remove any of that structure. But the only thing that you'd have to do is take out a few boards, which would ones where the plants would be sitting on. But obviously, when you're working on these things, as the heat's gone down, you want to be maintaining the heat. If there's going to be a severe frost or something like that, if it's fairly mild, then you could leave the compost bin unturned for a week or two, the heat will die down a little bit. But then if you want to bring it up to heat again, you can just aerate that bin, and then the temperatures will start to go up. So you're only turning this when it's a nice mild day or a relatively mild day. So if you've got plants in here, obviously you can move those into another cold frame or anything, whilst so you're not exposing them to a huge sort of shock. So I've shown here a sort of I've got the rafter sort of details here, and this is like the glazing beads, and then I've got a kind of little cover strip which is made out of a piece of black PVC pipe that's just been split down the middle, or cut down the middle into the two halves, just using a circular saw. So I've made that, or just shown a basic jig, just the three sides that's sort of crudely screwed together. So the opening in the centre is the size of the pipe, and then to get the holes equidistant along the length of the pipe on one side of the jig, I've just got a screw hole or self-tapping countersunk screw that goes into there. And then what you'll do is you'll just sort of set the blade so it's half the height of the tube, carefully run it through the saw so it cuts the bottom opening, and then you'll spin it around 180 degrees, and then you'll cut it again a second time, so then that'll separate the two pieces. So that'll give you this sort of semicircular little cover strip. The other thing I was thinking about is mini fit trunking, but I think the PVC is a lot cheaper, and you only need a small section. So if you could cut these into sort of 6 foot lengths and then run them through the saw, and then you've got lots of material, because you obviously get 2 pieces out from each bit of pipe. But I've noticed this sort of fish scale sort of effect on Victorian greenhouses, where they have sort of this radius on the bottom edge. I'm not sure how effective it is, and I haven't seen this since the Victorians, but as water is beading down here, it'll form on the edge of that glass, and in this case I'm using acrylic, and it'll run down to the lowest point and then drip off and run down. So what it's in effect is trying to do is actually move moisture away from what in the Victorian greenhouses, which would be pine and puttied sort of glazing bars. So on here I'd probably use hardwood underneath, but then it's protected by the cover strip, and if you were really elaborate, you could actually put a bead of silicone or something on there, and then you could set that strip down so it's watertight. But these would be mainly roofs for cold frames and compost bins, so I'm not really worried about that being 100% watertight. And with these things as well, there's aeration in here, so I mean that would have opening on the north side there, that would open, and as heat rises it would tend to move air through as well. Yeah, so I think that's up to speed now with the sketches in here. This is just this is slightly different as well, because it doesn't show the bucket. So this is the subfloor. The subfloor is actually part of the lower bucket, and then this soil feeding station will be held in the upper container. But I'm just showing here, this is like a kind of toilet tube. This is the big poster tube, and just some details there showing how the two bits are wired together. So you'll get the sharp ends, loop them through one of the squares, and then just get a pair of pliers and lever it around so it twists it so you haven't got enough sharp edges sticking out. And that shows this sort of capillary tube, which is the PET 500ml bottle with the top and bottom cut off, just to make a little cylinder, a little tube. And then this is an old cotton t-shirt and corrugated cardboard that's been wrapped round into a spiral, and then when it's about the same diameter as that, it's pushed down into that bottle. So with the soil feeding station with the worms, there is a hole here as well, so the bottom of that is actually sitting into that capillary tube. So the worms in here, they'll move down, they'll eat the cardboard as well, so that will encourage movement of worms down into the biochar and circulation of material and nutrients as well. So yeah, that's the little sketchbook so far. It's a nice little thing. It's yeah, Traveller's Company. Midori. It's I think the paper's Midori, or the whole thing's made by Midori. But it takes fountain pen ink quite well, and it dries out quite fast, so it doesn't sort of tend to smudge, and it doesn't drip, and it doesn't tend to bleed through too much as well. So you can work back to back, and you don't see any of the well, you obviously can see through the paper a little bit, but the ink isn't actually bleeding through. I'm going to find it now. The pen I'm using is it's a Lamy Safari, which is quite nice. They're made in Germany. They're not expensive, but they're quite nice quality. I'm just using a coloured pencil just to add a little bit of colour and a little bit of rendering, just to give it a little bit more of a sort of visual quality and a bit more depth. Yeah, so thanks for watching. It's quite a lot of information. It's probably worth, if you're interested in any of these processes, to watch some of my videos too, and I'll link those at the end. Thanks for watching.